There's been a great deal of talk both in our industry and other industries about the utilisation of artificial intelligence. I've been really interested in artificial intelligence for the vast majority of my career. In actual fact, I preferred augmented intelligence, where we're actually using machine learning, but we're also using the skill, knowledge and competence of particular individuals. If you also look at the advent in terms of the move towards big data analytics, all of these things provide both opportunities and threats, both to our industry and to other industries themselves. During this presentation, what I'd like to do is to show some of the things that I consider we should be looking at in terms of the use of artificial intelligence and big data analytics to help us with our fight against cybercrime. But also we've got to be very cognizant of the fact that all of those facilities and all of those technologies are also open to the people that will mount attacks against us. If you look at traditional IT security, cyber security, what we're looking at doing is four primary things: the reduction of threat, the reduction of vulnerability, avoidance, which is now not really possible. So in other words, we can't not connect our shops or our systems to the internet, and therefore our ability to completely avoid a threat is diminished, but also the ability to detect and also to recover. These are the primary things that we've always had within our armoury in terms of cybersecurity or general security controls. If we cover the reduction of threat first, historically it's been extremely difficult to reduce the level of threat. So in other words, what can we do? We haven't necessarily got a judicial system that will allow us to do things. And what we've had to do is to look at ways of trying to reduce threat. There's a lot of conversation about this, and threat is a badly used term. A lot of the time people are saying they're reducing threat, when in actual fact they're reducing vulnerabilities. There are a few initiatives that we've tried to do, working with the National Crime Agency to stop young people going into cybercrime by providing intervention points and working with Met Police Falcon. But those things are limited in terms of their overall impact. Very important, but limited. In other words, there's not very many things we can do to actually reduce the threat. If there's a huge benefit associated with it, the likelihood of being caught or prosecuted is very low, and therefore the ability for people to work in the dark side of the industry is very high. But what we can do is to look at using that for the reduction of threat for the first time ever if we start to use artificial intelligence techniques. What we can do is we can use that to look through huge amount of threat intelligence information. So in other words, we can look to see what the trends are, what's really happening within our networks and systems, and start to take proper views about changes in the threats. So in other words, we can see a threat evolving, we can see a threat agent changing, and we can mirror that against our environment to see whether or not we have to do changes. And this is the first time ever that we've been able to use this artificial intelligence combined with big data analytics coming out the back end of our secure operation centres and our network monitoring and logging tools, as well as monitoring across the internet. At that point, we can start to look at geopolitical data, big data analytics to work out where our problems potentially come from and where the real architects of these types of particularly state-sponsored attack might come from. We can look again at big data in terms of understanding the marketing techniques that people are going to be mounting against us. So in other words, if I was a cybersecurity criminal, I'd absolutely be using new and modern marketing techniques to encourage people to open emails that they wouldn't necessarily normally do. And that's exactly the same from a marketing perspective in a more traditional organisation. We can look at big data analytics as well as the social media, and we can actually now start to use that big data analytics to identify what's actually being said about us in the media, what's being said about us in terms of social media, to see whether things have changed and whether or not we have to be more aware. Historically, it's been very easy for us to identify a problem within a building. Within a government building, all of a sudden, if the threat rating goes up, then what we do is we have people that are more vigilant, and you understand that we move from a normal environment to be an environment where we're slightly more controlled over the types of visitors that we allow in and the types of controls that are in place. But in addition to that, we've also got social media, we've got the dark web, and we need to have some form of analytics in there to understand what's going on. But they are huge places. And if we don't use artificial intelligence and big data analytics to do that work, we're not going to derive the benefits we can from the technologies. And finally, if we're actually using our marketing in a positive way for our organisation, we can also use it to help with the threat intelligence, because we can use the monitoring of what's going on in terms of conversations about us on the internet to actually feed into our threat scenario. So in other words, we can be much more prescriptive in terms of the information that's available about sector or even organisation specific threat actors. In terms of penetration testing and the implementation of technical standards to reduce vulnerabilities, again, what we want to do is to understand exactly how we're going to use artificial intelligence in the future. What we're going to do is decide, first of all, what level of protection is required. And I think at the bottom end in particular, we can definitely use some of the vulnerability assessment tools. And if you look at the evolution of those vulnerability assessment tools are now using big data analytics, and they're also particularly using artificial intelligence to help them to actually go through and identify trends and analysis. So in other words, we can start to use some of the techniques we've got, although we don't necessarily call them artificial intelligence, we can use that in a way that allows us to have much better organisation and structure at that bottom level, providing structured vulnerability assessment processes. Again, what that allows us to do is to have greater level of confidence at the bottom end. Automation actually allows access to markets. So in other words, small organisations can use those tools to really help them, even though they can't necessarily afford an expert to come in and have a look at those systems and to ensure they're appropriate. But that advanced vulnerability assessment tools, I believe in the future, will provide some of the opportunity for the SMEs who are really struggling with this concept in terms of how to secure themselves. And at the same time, what we can do is make sure we're adequate spend in terms of the specialist areas that have to have a human intervention associated with them are associated with the work at the top. But again, supported by initial vulnerability assessment to identify the areas of concern that we wanted to work from. Therefore, what we're saying is it's very difficult to support the bottom end of the market due to the lack of resource and cost. We are, within our cybersecurity industry, strapped for resource and availability. So in other words, what we need to do is the concentration will therefore be where the most money is, but that actually leaves the bottom end of the marketplace exposed, and I believe the use of artificial intelligence in particular will really help that. The attack tools we're actually trying to protect against are also becoming much more sophisticated at that point. So in other words, our advocates, the people that are mounting attacks against us, are also using more advanced techniques. The attack tools are becoming much more intelligent and much more hidden in terms of the way they're approaching. And therefore what we need to do is to continue this battle. But I think if it's a tool-to-tool based battle at the bottom elements, then I think we stand a chance. If it's a tool against people, then I think there's an imbalance because of the amount of availability of skilled resource in this area. And also we need to assess the outcome based of these tools. So in other words, what we need to do is to look at the approaches adopted by other professions. We're seeing accountants, auditors, structural engineers working with sophisticated tools to help them. They are very concerned, some of those professions, they will be replaced by tools. But I think in our industry, there is so much to be done that if we don't have a balance between the use of tools and the use of intelligent-based individuals working in this industry, we're not going to win the battle. If you then look at the bottom area, we then start with things like cyber essentials, basic cyber hygiene with some basic controls, secure configuration, boundary and firewall management, access control and privilege management, patch management and malware reversing or malware protection. The interesting things about those are, I believe they are the current threats. So in other words, what we're doing at the moment is we're protecting small enterprise and those that are trying to meet a cyber essential standard right at the bottom level. But if you look at what was happening there, I believe that we've got to be doing some research to actually look to and understand the evolution of the threat. If we are going to be successful in terms of protecting organisations, then that basic level of cyber hygiene, I believe, will need to be changed over time. And in addition to that, we need to put technologies in place, including artificial intelligence, that will actually help us to meet the evolving threat scenarios that are coming through to us in a way that can actually be adopted and can be rolled out in a consistent way. If you look at this, we need to investigate new ways to combat these new generation of threats. At the moment, for small enterprise, I use the example of if we're in a small shop in a high street, then really we're responsible for everything to do with our own internal security. We have to have security on the doors, we have to have security cameras, all of those sorts of things, and we're responsible for everything. If the threat increases significantly, what you then do is you move your shop inside a shopping mall where we've got access to secure CCTV, we have security guards, we close all the doors at the end of the day, we have monitoring 24 hours. All of those things are going on, which actually improves our level of security. And I believe for the small enterprise, the answer to that is commoditized security services, or even move more to a cloud security perspective in terms of What we're doing is we're moving the business into an area where we can provide greater levels of protection 24/7 and actually have greater levels of assurance in terms that those controls are operating in an appropriate way. We might even need to change that model in that way. And really what I'm describing is the concept that we've now got the mafia going in to attack small shops. And what we've now got is organised crime going in and actually attacking both charities and small enterprise. And therefore we've got to think of a way of commoditising security in a way that can actually provide appropriate levels of protection to those organisations. And I believe that artificial intelligence will provide some of the solution to that. I'm a great believer in some of our existing security standards. 27001 is really good. 20,000 from an infrastructure management perspective I think is excellent. Those management systems are really good. But what we need to do is to look at that and provide more formal links between the technology-based technical assurance with those security standards. In theory at least, you can actually not put any controls in place and still be compliant with 27001 because you have a security improvement plan that will move you in those areas. I won't say all, but some of the auditors that are doing this work in 27001 are not as technically competent as they need to be to understand the logs, understand the systems and the environments. And therefore we've got to be very careful in terms of understanding what level of benefits the standards provide. They are absolutely there to help us with the management. They're absolutely there to help structure the organisation and to take a more professional approach to looking at it. But what we need to do is to consider, first of all, how we start to put those minimum standards into those areas. Again, things like basic cyber hygiene should be a mandatory standard, I believe, in some of the management control systems. But in addition to that, we shouldn't be too prescriptive because the evolution of the threats is going to be significant and I think it's going to escalate and get faster. And therefore, what we need to do is to ensure that those standards are flexible enough that they can encompass the changes in the threats. Currently, it takes an awful long time to change an ISO standard because it has to go through full committee. There's nothing wrong with that, but what we need to do is to have the agility underneath that to actually reflect that in a more effective way. And I do strongly believe that what we need to do is to look in terms of the concept of continual threat management, and that should be a topic of research. So in other words, how do we move from a periodic audit from a 27001 person to something which is more of a continual management process and the ability to monitor and have some demonstrability in there. Traditional views of periodic audit, I think, will also start to change. We're already seeing that within the audit community with the move from periodic audit to continual audit using tools and using tool-based analysis. And what we should be doing is thinking about how we can mirror those in terms of our security management systems. Traditional audit firms are working out what that means to their business in terms of both their individuals and the way they're delivering services to their clients. But I think there is no alternative. We have to have continual audit. We have to have continual threat monitoring. We have to continue to monitor our services through our secure operations centres and our network monitoring and logging. What we now need to do is to pull all of those elements of continual process together so we have a considered and collaborative view. In cyber, I think we can take a much more proactive approach to a lot of this because we're very used to using technologies and we're used to using technologies to help us. So again, within artificial intelligence, I think we as an industry are going to be much more flexible in terms of our use of tools and to understand where the tool provides a benefit and where it starts to stop. And we need to look at the existing security management systems and make sure they stand up in the context of the evolving threat. I'm not saying we have to change the way that ISO standards are done, but I think that evolution and that agility underneath them in terms of the controls that we have to have in place should reflect the types of changes we're seeing in terms of the threat scenarios, not a change every 5 years in terms of some of the standards themselves. In terms of critical national infrastructure, again, there's a significant amount of conversation going on there in terms of how we provide technical assurance in this particular area. And what we're seeing there is the emergence of the threat intelligence industry, providing input to those areas in terms of identifying the types of threat agents and actors that we're seeing coming into our environments that are likely to mount an attack and how they're going to mount those attacks. This, again, as I mentioned, is one of the only times I've seen the ability to actually monitor the threat. But in this critical national infrastructure area, this is more important than anything else, to understand exactly what's happening from the threat scenario perspective and rolling them in. And what that allows us to do is to have evidence-based and contextualised penetration testing or red teaming. So in other words, we then start to build on the artificial intelligence and big data analytics about what's really happening on our networks and systems, and then we can start to build our technical penetration testing around that, whilst also looking at the intelligent vulnerability analysis tools underneath them that provide us sort of basic levels of control and assurance. So again, artificial intelligence is the reason that the new cybersecurity technology industry exists in terms of threat intelligence, and I believe that's flourishing and we'll move that forward. Also, for the first time ever, I think we can exercise our continuity plans against real-life scenarios. So again, rather than dreaming something up, we can actually base it on what's happening. And again, the access to threat intelligence based on artificial intelligence and big data analytics will allow us to do that in a much more structured way. We then move to detection. Given the amount of attacks that are coming through across our network, the ability to identify anomalies is becoming increasingly difficult. And therefore, the ability to use our security monitoring and logging, our secure operations center to detect anomalies or attack profiles is becoming more and more difficult. What we're seeing is much greater and much more efficient tools in terms of those secure operations centers. But what we need to do is to continue to build on those to make sure that they reflect both the current and emerging threats, and also we understand the inputs from both the incidents that people are seeing as well as the threat intelligence areas. Again, I believe that will move us towards the concept for the first time ever of continual threat monitoring. So in other words, rather than looking at directly what's in our face and what's coming towards us, we'll be able to take a slightly wider horizon view and hopefully start to see some of the attacks coming over the hill before they actually arrive on our doors. What that means is that we have to have a lot more confidence in terms of our monitoring control systems. The ability to do SOC accreditation, for example, secure operations centers, we need to have confidence they're operating. And at the moment, I believe it's extremely difficult to buy in that area. CREST has been working for more than 3 years with the industry, with governments and some of the regulators to look at how we could accredit SOCs. And at the moment we are working towards the concept of having a document review, on-site audits and then a formal technical evaluation of the SOC environment. What that means is we can have greater levels of assurance of the information that's being gathered and the ability for the SOC to escalate in terms of understanding where a threat is coming from and when it's actually moving towards us. And certainly SOCs utilise big data analytics. And if we haven't got artificial intelligence sitting behind there, looking at that big data and driving it forward to identify anomalies and threat behaviour, then really we are gathering information we're not going to use. Professionally run SOCs already exist, and a lot of those are using artificial intelligence techniques at least, if not artificial intelligence systems. And the AI service should be used in a way of supporting decisions. So they shouldn't replace the decision-making process, but as much information as we can make available to people making decisions at that point, we should be doing. So in other words, we should be using augmented intelligence to help humans make sensible decisions about the level of invocation or what's actually happening within the environment. For the first time ever, in this particular industry, we can have the concept of invocation before an attack. So in other words, if we see something coming over the hill, a change in the threat scenario, a change in the types of attacks, a change in the types of people that are attacking us or organisations, or we can see vulnerabilities coming because they're attacking similar platforms to those we have, we can then take what I would class as almost evasive actions. In line with what we do with physical buildings, we can heighten awareness. So in other words, we can tell people to be more vigilant, both in terms of the network controllers, the people in the SOC, but also the frontline people that are actually seeing this stuff and understanding if they believe they're seeing anomalies or changes, they should be reporting quickly and escalating it. If we're seeing particularly attacks come in terms of some of the infrastructure or some of the technologies we had, then you can click straight into a configuration review to make sure all their patches are up to date, make sure everything is configured correctly, make sure we have our firewalls in the right place, make sure we're monitoring the right things in terms of our secure operations centers or our network monitoring and logging. And that provides us with the ability to do an update straight away. So if we are vulnerable to a particular type of attack, we can make sure that all the patching and updates are done and we can make sure we've implemented it appropriately. If we wanted to prove that, then also we can then start to instigate a penetration test. Penetration testing historically has been something that you plan. So in other words, you think we're going to do this in the future. It could be periodic. It could be because we've got a new system or a significant change. What I think this does is it provides us the opportunity to run against a real scenario that we're seeing coming across. and therefore the penetration test becomes much more specific in terms of providing a level of assurance that we are appropriately controlled against a particular type of attack. And finally, recovery. Recovery is a really important thing because we have to appreciate that we're not going to be able to protect ourselves against everything. And even if we invoke before attack, that might mean we have to close things down. But what this actually allows us to do at this point is we're trying to provide protection in a way that we can scale. So in other words, if we invoke in a structured way, then our ability to recover becomes much easier. If we've already been attacked, then what we're is a position where we're not only having to understand how we recover the business, but how we have to clean it up and how we have to ensure that there are no vulnerabilities left, which will allow the attack vector to take place again. So again, from an incident response perspective, very difficult to provide support at the lower level. Really, if you report these things, it's a statistical thing. Police will be really interested in it, but they're not necessarily there to help. Some of the government departments and some of the government systems are absolutely there to help, but again, capacity and things in terms of providing services to the lower end of the market is quite difficult. But we can start to use AI to do some of the malware reverse engineering and also to support the lower end of the market. We can also build AI concepts in terms of the certs and some of the information exchanges, because now we're getting so much information going in there, it's really difficult to identify what's relevant to us and how we can utilise that material. So I think some more research needs to be done to understand how we can use artificial intelligence to help us to understand what's happening in our information exchanges and to interpret what we're getting in terms of the information going to certs about incidents. We have a skill shortage, is something that's regularly said. What does that actually mean? It means that we have a lack of skills within some of the people we have already within our industry, and what we need to do is to encourage more people in. So it's really a two-pronged attack. But what we need to do is to upskill our existing workforce, therefore, and encourage the very best people to come into our industry. If you look at what's happening to other industries where it is costly to provide those services, or there is a lack of people available, they're all being impacted by big data analytics and artificial intelligence. The auditors of the future will be using a lot more tools, and we don't understand what the law is going to look like in terms of moving people forward in terms of their careers as they're newly qualified to get them up to partner level, for example. The gap in the middle is going to be filled by some tools and some techniques. And therefore, what we need to do is to look at how the marketplace will react to the problem that we have. A lack of skilled people that are expensive, difficult to find, and we're not dragging enough people into our industry to actually fill that gap. Marketplaces always operate in the same way. So in other words, what we need to do at that point is the marketplace will react by trying to move towards automation. Automation in this space, because we're automating a professional concept, is the move towards artificial intelligence, and the actual ability to do that will be based on big data analytics. And therefore that operating as a traditional industry is extremely important. We then look at the top of the tree in terms of things like charter status, not necessarily completely related to artificial intelligence, but what we've now done in the cybersecurity industry is we've moved from the concept of moving a cart and horses over a very small bridge, and if that breaks, somebody falls in the water, and if you're really unlucky, the horse falls on top of you. We've moved from that to how do we have chartered structural engineers that would look at the Forth Bridge or look at rail bridges or road bridges or individual structures. And what we need to do is have greater levels of confidence. And I think within the cybersecurity industry, we've moved from the disclosure of a small amount of information to potential impacts on critical national infrastructure or massive impacts in terms of the amount of data that's leaked about personal information. And therefore what we need to do is to have a profession that moves towards a charter status so we can have a conversation at an equivalent level with an auditor, an accountant, a structural engineer, or all of the other professions in those areas. And I believe what we need to do with our charter status individuals is to make sure they've got access to as much decision-making processes as they can. And again, the use of artificial intelligence and the ability to do big data analytics is the way that we're going to do that. So in summary, I believe that artificial intelligence is moving forward in terms of all of these areas. The concept of reduction of risk in terms of reduction of threat for the first time is available. Reduction of vulnerability will see more use of advanced vulnerability assessment tools, Our ability to detect through our network monitoring and logging and through our secure operations centre will also, I think, have to evolve over time and evolve very quickly in terms of the changes of the threats. And then finally, our ability to recover, I think, will be incumbent on us to understand how we invoke in a structured way as soon as possible, and therefore how we retract back from that. If you overlay the skills part in terms of that as well, in terms of providing support to a scarce resource, then I believe that the use of artificial intelligence and big data analytics will really help us within our industry. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that those types of techniques and tools are also available to the people that are mounting attacks against us.